Well, happy Wednesday and welcome to today's panel. My name is Hannah Thompson and I'm on the content publishing team at Nexus Marketing, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel. Today we'll be talking about how e-learning can benefit nonprofits. And as usual, before I introduce our wonderful panelists here with us today and we dive into this topic, I'll cover a few logistics. So a little bit about NX Unite, which is made in partnership with Nexus Marketing. It's a community resource for the mission-driven industry. The NX Unite mission is to make introductions that lead to lasting relationships and serve as a hub for connection in the mission-driven sector. As you just saw in our video on NX Unite, you can find upcoming industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, cause-driven podcasts, and of course, panels with experts such as these lovely folks with me today. Today, our panel will be about an hour long and will include both time for questions curated by my team and then questions from you all, our audience. So at any time, and even now, during the panel, please feel free to submit your questions via the questions tab. And then also, if you're having technical difficulties or any logistics questions, my team member, Anton Duran, will be in the chat as NX Unite team username, ready to do his best to assist. And then finally, before I introduce today's panelists, I just want to thank everybody for being here, both our panelists and our attendees. I know all of our attendees are doing great work in the mission-driven sector. And we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be here with us. The panel is going to be recorded and accessible to both current audience members and people who register to watch it afterward online. And yeah, so you'll get that coming to you after the panel is over. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And now I'm going to introduce the outstanding experts that we're going to be learning from today. So I'll start with Dorothy. Dorothy Norris-Tyrrell, Chief Learning Officer at the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. Dorothy Norris-Tyrrell, PhD, CNP, is the Chief Learning Officer for the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. Her career has centered on building individual and organizational capacity to address public problems through collaboration and innovation. As a learning experience architect, Dorothy embraces creative strategies that expand knowledge and understanding. She has extensive experience as a faculty member, nonprofit administrator, consultant, and volunteer. Dorothy's scholarship focuses on nonprofit organization leadership, including career pathways and cross-sector collaboration. Dan Streeter, VP of Learning Strategy and Development at Blue Sky eLearn. As the Vice President of Learning Strategy and Development, Dan leads his world-class team of instructional design professionals to enable nonprofits, associations, and businesses to build exceptional learning content. Dan became an expert in learning, instructional design, and presentation delivery from over 20 years of experience as an award-winning public education teacher, administrator, and entrepreneur. Vanessa Douthard, EdTech Specialist at CYPHER Learning. Vanessa is an EdTech Specialist for CYPHER Learning and an expert in learning technologies and design. She has years of experience as an instructor, instructional designer, and user experience designer. Her passions include meaningful, critical, and strategic technology integration for training and education. John Lay, CEO and lead analyst at Talented Learning. John is an independent learning technology consultant, analyst, podcaster, blogger, and CEO of Talented Learning, a learning tech education and advisory firm focused on extended enterprise education. He's a trusted learning tech veteran with over 25 years and $125 million worth of frontline experience in buying and selling complex learning solutions. Since 2014, John has reviewed over 250 learning solutions and has helped over 150 LMS buyers define their requirements and buy the right learning system for their needs. Lastly, he also consults with learning systems vendors to benchmark capabilities, provides competitive analysis, expands market reach, and improves sales. Well, thank all of you so much for being here today. And now it's finally time to hear from our panelists. Dorothy, I'll start with you. How has e-learning and digitally accessible resources evolved within the last few years? Oh, apologies, Dorothy, you're muted.
That's the number one issue with these, isn't it? So much change in technology, and it's fabulous news because we have so many new technologies to work with today. We are all at the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance, our programs, the Certified Nonprofit Professional and Leaderosity Learning Library. We really focus on meeting the learner's learning style. So all of these new technologies allow us to really address different learning styles. No longer are we just focused on video content with a little text and some links. We have audio, we have interactive learning opportunities, we have interactive assessments, peer engagement, same time or real-time peer engagement, which really is exciting for someone designing the courses. And I hear that it's very exciting for the learner as well. It's also allowed us to really think about the needs of the learner in different ways. For example, we have worked hard to make sure that individuals with hearing or vision issues are able to access our coursework just like anyone else would be. So we've worked with screen readers and Zoom magnifier to make sure that access is available with everything we do. And finally, I think maybe the biggest of all technology change has been the mobile first emphasis now. No matter what you're using to access the courses, phones, laptops, tablets, you can access it and you have the same access. Great question and a fun one.
Yes, thank you, Dorothy. I appreciate how, you kind of identified that we have so many more resources, which means we can really meet people where they are and with what they need. So thank you, Dorothy. So turning to you, Vanessa, how have you seen e-learning and digitally accessible resources change over the last few years?
Yeah, thank you. So I definitely agree with Dorothy about the learner-centeredness and the user-centeredness of resources. But I think I would also add in there this new approach. Well, it's not really a new approach, but this approach of data-driven learning. It's something that I tend to see a lot as an ed tech specialist. In my job, I have this really cool responsibility of acclimating people to our LMS environment. So I see a lot of use cases happening, and data-driven learning seems to be a lot bigger recently. So there used to be kind of this really predictable process, especially when we go before the learner-centered approach that Dorothy was talking about. And it was this predictable process where, people would put out their training or their instruction in the form of a course, and then people would do the assessments, they would get the final grade, maybe they would get a certificate, and then it's kind of like rinse and repeat over and over again. But with the data-driven learning, now we're starting to see a lot more of organizations and trainers or whoever really collecting these various types of data and using them as insight into what is impacting learner success, either positively or negatively. And what that does is it allows us as instructional designers or as course developers to really focus on any areas where the data is showing a breakdown within the system, and it allows us to correct those breakdowns to reach people so they're not being unnecessarily blocked from learning because of the design of our content or course.
Thanks, Vanessa. I really appreciate how your answer kind of carried that theme of accessibility that Dorothy mentioned, using the data to make sure that the learning is accessible, whether like through the technology, and that it's really serving the learner. That's awesome. All right, turning to you, John, what has changed with e-learning over the past few years?
Well, a lot's changed for sure with the pandemic and with everybody going virtual and hybrid learning. It's really encouraged that or made that a primary focus of learning organizations to nonprofits, or to in any learning organization, to figure out how to adapt to that and how to adapt to that quickly. So I think over the last couple of years, at first organizations were in the frying pan, adapting quickly to the changes and how they could deliver in virtual and hybrid models. And now organizations are looking at it, at least from our perspective, of it's no longer just good enough to do it. That's table stakes. It's now competitively, how do we do it better than our competition? How can we make it more engaging? How can we use that data-driven model to help the learning process? So to pile on Vanessa's data-driven model, the other side of that data-driven is to make the learning adaptive. And so what I see many organizations doing now is taking data from the AMS system or the CRM system inside the organization, any type of data, whether they attended this show in 2021 and not in 2022, is a data point that could drive learning or adaptive process or a different ad or a different experience for that particular learner. And so what I see the best organizations doing now as we're coming out the other side of the pandemic is to take that learning and go from courses to resources and to be able to allow people to get what they need when they need it, whether that's informal or whether that's a formal training plan, but doing that in a way that is really specific to who they are and the actions that they're taking inside and outside the learning management system.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think definitely identifying, obviously the pandemic kind of shifted so many things and with learning, and now we're, we've adapted to that. Like how are we taking it a step further? And I think that's really cool to hear what you're saying in the industry. So thank you. All right, Dan, on to you. How has e-learning and digitally accessible resources changed within the last few years?
Well, I really like what all three of the other panelists have said. And really what Dorothy had said was that the teachers now, in terms of online learning, we're really out to be able to meet the need where it is. And that's, I think, what great classroom instructors do. And I think that's what great digital instructors do as well. I think the other part around the data is we're getting away from this notion of, I taught it, you didn't learn it. Right. So instead, what we have the ability now to do is through that data is that we can go ahead and we can begin to know, what's working and what's not. The other thing that I think has changed dramatically is so many of the tools that we now have available. So, for example, there's a product or a document called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are the WCAG 2.0, 2.1, and now just about to be 2.2, that really help us to understand how can we conform to ensure that all truly means all when we're taking a look at education. And so, for example, we're talking about things like PowerPoint, Adobe Acrobat, all the Creative Cloud items, Storyline, if you're using that. PDF, the University Accessibility Foundation, JAWS readers. I mean, truly, we now are figuring out ways to make sure that education is available to every single learner, professional, academic, whatever. We have the ability to be able to access them in a way that never before could we. And so that, for me, is what's most exciting about learning today.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. That is really exciting. Just having that. I think we've talked about the really learner centric and being very thorough about like making sure everyone can access it. So thank you, Dan. Well, our next question has to do with some best practices. So John, I'll ask you to lead off for this one. What advice do you have for nonprofit organizations when they're looking to implement an e-learning system?
That's a good question. Just as a side note, I know I'm in the right panel because you guys are awesome, listening to all your enthusiasm. So thanks for inviting me. Great to be among such professionals. I think that the biggest thing that organizations do wrong, I think, is not begin with the end in mind. And so I think it's really important for a nonprofit to understand what exactly they're trying to change. I mean, all nonprofits are trying to change something for the better. And so what exactly are they trying to change with what audiences, and really develop a solid plan on how you can get there, some sort of roadmap. It's easy, I think, to want to go out and do a course or create a course or put a course up for sale. But what I find is if we're going to take a step back and create that plan first, then it's a lot easier to take those smaller steps and adjust on the way, as long as you know where that end goal is going. And so even though that's kind of simple advice, it's amazing how often it's not followed in my experience.
Yeah, thank you, John. Knowing what your mission is and making sure that what you're doing in every kind of aspect of your strategy is really aligned with that. Awesome. Well, turning to you, Dan, what are some best practices that can help nonprofits with implementing an e-learning system?
I could not agree more with John that first off, it is really starting with the why and figuring out why in the world are we making this move in general, and really figuring out how this learning management system or how this learning that we're going to create really aligns with our overall mission. And I think that that really begins with an education-focused strategic plan. If you're an association, you're a nonprofit group, you have an organizational strategic plan. Well, there needs to be an education-focused version of that as well that aligns with that broader organizational strategic plan. I think in addition to that, I would say that you need to have one person who's going to lead the charge, and you need to have somebody identified in the organization who can do that. I think that one of the places that we miss is really around integrations. And John, I'm certain that you can speak to this a great deal around things like how are you going to integrate things like your association management system? How will you keep track of CE units? How will you manage like your customer management system if you're using Salesforce or Fontiva? And then how are you going to do things like community management systems like Higher Logic? How will you pull all of those items together? And I think the last part to know is that your LMS expert and your educational strategist and your e-learning developer, typically they are three different people. And I think that lots of times we expect nonprofit groups to say, like, we're going to get this one person who can do all of that. It just doesn't happen that way. You can't be experts in everything. And I think that especially in the learning space, specifically for associations and nonprofit groups, you're going to get somebody who's great at one of those, but not great at all three. That's the reason why it's so important you bring in people like John and Vanessa and Dorothy to be able to help to really create that strategy.
Excellent.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, assembling your team is so important. I really like that you also identified that it's really important when you're going through this process to have a specific owner who's really responsible for everything and coordinating with those different experts to make sure that the information is getting shared and all the voices are getting heard as you're making sure your strategy is aligned with your mission. Vanessa, you're up next. What should organizations keep in mind that might help when they're implementing an e-learning system?
So I definitely agree with what's been said previously. I think having a plan about how you're going to manage the project of integrating a new system into your organization is really important, especially if you've never used one before, but even if you have used one before. From just personally, professionally, historical evidence, as John kind of mentioned, has proven to me that the organizations that do have a phased out plan or any type of plan regarding how they're going to integrate and implement tend to have a much easier time actually executing the integration of a system. And just to kind of go off in a slightly different route, speaking from an LMS standpoint, thinking about how, whether you're moving in between digital environments or you're coming from a face-to-face environment into a digital environment, how the integration of that content is going to work in a new digital environment is also something to think about. Speaking from an LMS standpoint, the primary example of this that I can give that I see fairly often in my work is with gamification. So our platform offers gamification, and sometimes we get people who will come to us super excited about this feature. And I've had more than one person say to me, yeah, this gamification feature is going to make my content way less boring, and it's going to make my students so much more engaged. And when they are thinking about it that way, it's exciting. But then when I work with them, I tend to see them taking what they have and kind of mapping it over to a digital environment at face value without really thinking about what needs to be tweaked or adjusted or changed a little bit to make that digital engagement feature, that social feature, a little bit more accessible to people who are now within a digital environment. So that's another thing that I would add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. Being aware of the context. Yeah. All right, Dorothy. Any other suggestions for that can assist nonprofits who are interested in implementing an e-learning system?
Well, I'm team set your goal first. So all of us are on the same path here. Know what you're doing and why is so essential. I think what I would add to this conversation is it's okay to start small. So from a planning perspective, you don't have to roll out your complete integrated portal or whatever you're hoping ultimately to create at one time. You can take a step at a time and be successful and understand that it's a very iterative process. You're going to roll this out, you're going to learn. So you're going to want to go back and revise that first thing you did and take those changes forward. And so this is not a do it and never come back to it. It's you're going to keep changing and revising as you learn more about your content and you learn more about your learner, for sure.
On my podcast, I've had the opportunity of interviewing about 25 of Dorothy's peers, and I ask them that same question, and time again, I get that start small, revise advice. It seems to be what all experts know.
Well, I think that's a really good support of us being in a panel that's focused on learning, is that even when you're trying to encourage your nonprofit to have a learning strategy, you've got to be aware that there are opportunities to learn in the process. That's great, Dorothy. Vanessa, I'm going to start this next question with you. So how can e-learning and digitally accessible resources support a nonprofit's development and operations?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I think just looking at digital resources alone, e-learning and having them offered digitally, make them more wide-reaching so they can be accessed from anywhere in the world. Also, going back to what previous people have said about accessibility, they can benefit from accessibility features such as the screen reading technology, closed captioning and subtitles on videos. There are so many more accessibility features that we can have that aren't inherent with manual resources. So we can build that equity into a digital resource or into the distribution of a digital resource using technology. When it comes to e-learning, again, I'm going to cover this from an LMS standpoint. Those can also be wide-reaching, and you can kind of heighten and lower your scope of where you want those e-learning tools to reach or how you want them to reach. Automated learning has absolutely become something that is a lot bigger. So more easily managing the flow of learning for learners using automation within a system. So it kind of takes that workload off of the developers as learners go through their courses. Personalized learning, which I know is something that somebody, I think it was John, mentioned a little bit earlier. So assisting learners with learning management, kind of by enabling the system to meet learners where they are and to guide them through where they need to be. So kind of thinking about this automatic intervention for learners who might not be performing as well as we need them to, or extra work, or for learners who might be performing well. So personalized learning that's given to us through this digital medium is kind of taking us away from this one-size-fits-all approach, which I think is really important. And then there's also community building. So social learning features are often parts of LMSs. So taking digital environments from simply just a place where learners can complete the work that you give them to a space where they can also participate as a member of a connected community of people, I think is really how e-learning benefits organizations as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. Yeah. Nonprofits are always looking for creative ways to engage their supporters. And I think providing that learning is a great way to do it, like you were just mentioning. Thanks, Dorothy. On to you. How can an organization's development and operations benefit e-learning and digitally accessible resources?
Well, Vanessa gave a great answer. She covered a wide swath of territory there. I think the only thing I might add is that it can be very cost efficient. So rather than everybody traveling to a conference or a workshop, it's available to your whole team. So not just one person got that. hands-on perspective from the learning process, but a larger group did. And it didn't, as she mentioned, it doesn't matter what time zone you're in or what country you're in. You can access e-learning 24/7 and make it work in your time frame, in your schedule. So it can be very effective from a cost perspective, and you can train this larger group of people or expose them to learning opportunities would be my answer to that.
Awesome. Thank you, Dorothy. Yeah, I think as we're kind of like thinking about how we can make workplaces more flexible and kind of work for the employees. I know, especially within the nonprofit industry, really focused on that because there's such a high turnover for nonprofits. Having that e-learning benefit that you were just mentioning is both flexible and time saving that can have a big impact for your staff.
Absolutely.
So Dan, I'll turn to you. What support can e-learning and digitally accessible resources lend to a nonprofit's development and operations?
This is such a great question. And I think that, that again, it begins with the why. Really, what's the purpose of having a learning management system? Is it really to focus on networking? Is it about driving membership? Is it a fundraising tool? Is it member education? Is it internal focused? Or is it really something else? I think that that's really kind of the beginning. And I think that with Blue Sky, of course, we have a learning management system, we have virtual events, and of course, we have instructional design. And those are really kind of the three big components of creating an educational plan. And so I think that depending on what the why is, will be the one that you kind of focus on, especially kind of in the beginning. And I think that depending on what that need is, that's what will drive the features and functionality of something like a learning management system. So if it's really about creating networking, maybe it's about social learning. And if it's a place for fundraising, well, maybe it's something else. Or if it's a place around educating your members in industry, well, then maybe you're looking at creating more high-end learning that will go along with that. I think that that's really kind of a place to really consider. The other part that I would consider is how you're going to use third-party content on your site. You don't have to create all the content yourself. Well, how can the learning management system back up the use of that third-party content if that's appropriate to do? And I think the big part to remember is that every LMS provider, every virtual event provider, every instructional designer, they all do different things. And so once you define what the end outcome is that you want to be able to do, and you find an LMS is likely the best option, then you can figure out whether the features that are needed in order to accomplish that goal.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Calling out all those different ways that nonprofits can use a learning system, I think it is, I'm sure, sparked a lot of ideas for our listeners. All right, turning to you, John. What are other ways in which e-learning and digitally accessible resources can support a nonprofit's development and operations?
It's a lot easier going first with this group than fourth. For sure. So I think something that hasn't been said yet, or maybe just a little bit touched on by Dan, is it's important to know that nonprofit doesn't mean non-revenue. So revenue is really important to nonprofits to get to the mission out, whether that you're an association or an NGO, to be able to educate and get the mission out. So I think one of the biggest benefits of online learning is the ability to open up a new revenue stream that has value to your particular members. And that revenue stream can turn into something that allows you to basically broaden your mission and help it achieve your mission. And so I think just at a basic blocking and tackling standpoint, online learning is a way to generate revenue in an easier way than traditional methods. And you get all the things everybody says. It's broader, scalability. You can standardize that message and get it out. And a second point is, I talk to nonprofits every day, and I talk to organizations like LMS providers like Blue Sky and CYPHER every day. And I keep on hearing this common story about during the pandemic when organizations were caught not being able to have their live shows, and then they took their shows hybrid or virtual the first year. Something amazing happened. They all blew it out of the water. They all got way more attendees from all different parts of the world that wanted to participate in that education. And I think that's the second part, is you have a better chance to really broadcast your message to a global audience, without leaving in my case, Pennsylvania. And that's something that, is a big advantage to anybody that's trying to do some good and change the world.
Yeah, thank you, John. The nonprofit does not mean non-revenue. Yeah, I think so important to call out here that's another opportunity that if you're don't have any margin, then how are you going to accomplish your mission? So yeah, I think that's another great way to incorporate learning systems, and then also just another way to reach people, like you were mentioning. All right, this is going to be the last of my questions before I'll open up I'll open it up to our audience Q&A. So with that in mind, if you are holding on to any questions right now, don't hold on to them. Go ahead and submit them via the questions tab or in the chat as well. But before we dive into those, here is kind of this last question. So we all know that the opportunity for innovation and creativity is continuously growing. We've hit on that several times throughout the panel already. Dan, I'm going to have you start us off with this one. What tactics can nonprofits implement to build their organization's learning strategy and/or process?
So this is a great question. I think first off, you know that your LMS is not the silver bullet. But it can be a total game changer for your association, for your nonprofit group. And I think that what it does is it allows for you to be able to disseminate your message. It allows for the opportunity to provide professional growth opportunities, both internally and externally. It allows for the opportunity to be able to, of course, produce revenue. I mean, all of those things are super important to be able to do, including things like onboarding and gaining non-revenue dollars and all of that stuff that can come along with that. But I think one of the most important pieces is ensuring that you have an alignment with your strategic plan, making sure that you have evaluation metrics that say, this is how we know that it's going to be successful. And then creating a learning map that matches those metrics. And that way you're able to really identify who are the audiences that we're after and what are the learning objectives that those folks need? What inventory do we happen to have on hand? And I'm telling you, if you're a nonprofit group or an association, you certainly have content on hand that you can use. And then we also, of course, want to make sure that we're deciding on what's the best tools to be able to have around the learning management system. For example, do you have a specialized evaluation tool that you need? Especially if you're in like the medical space, you've got some pretty specialized evaluation needs that you might need. Well, we want to make sure that we have that. And you're going to have some other tools that have got to integrate with that learning management system. And then finally, I think that you want to make sure that you're focused on like the things like your e-commerce or what creation tool are you going to use? Is this going to be a SCORM file that's going to be uploaded and such? But every single thing that really is the crux of that begins with the strategic plan.
Fantastic insight. Thank you, Dan. Turning to you, John, what are some ways in which nonprofit organizations can strengthen their learning strategy and/or process?
Mm-hmm. Well, in 2022, the learning experience is so important. It's the most important because all of us here and everybody delivering learning is competing against the best of what is on your mobile phone on an app standpoint. That's not learning. And so we're constantly challenged in this industry to up our game and up the learning efficacy, up the fun, up the engagement factor of that. And so that's a big challenge in our industry. And what I think all nonprofits got to constantly thinking about is how to increase the bar of what they're putting out. And some of that can be, in the features, in the feature type. So here's some features that I've seen organizations do. One is that adaptive learning that I talked about. The second one that I see a lot is this concept of instead of just learning, but actually doing. So doing things outside the system, maybe uploading a video, uploading a picture of something, uploading an assignment that you did offline, and then having your cohort weigh in on it, grade it, or your teacher weigh on it, send it back for feedback. But that whole concept of doing, of not just receiving the knowledge and taking a test, is something that learners really appreciate. And the other thing is taking that learning out of the course. And so one of the other trends that I see a lot is concepts like, especially in continuing education, questions of the day. Read this case study, answer this question, once a week, sending that to your mobile phone. Or every time you log into the LMS, there's another one. And when you answer that, cumulative, you're earning continuing education credits. So as a way that it's not just a one-time event, but trying to convert these learners into a process where they're used to consuming and wanting to consume learning on a regular basis, I think is another strategy. And that leads to my final one of thinking in terms of that subscription. And so the best organization is you want to go after that reoccurring revenue. Once again, it's not nonprofit, it's or non-revenue. So what are ways that you can keep the learner engaged so that it's never really an opportunity to turn it off because you're providing so much value? And that reoccurring revenue concept is like an avalanche, a snowball. Is that every year, you get the ones you got last year plus your incremental, and as you expand, and it really enables you to do some good in the world with some predictable revenue. And so I hate to get all revenue based on a nonprofit, but thinking about how you can turn it into that reoccurring revenue model with learning is a way that you can help overall increase your mission or deploy your mission successfully.
Thank you, John. I feel like there's so many tactical things that can be like go straight into it today and implement it. All right, turning to you, Vanessa, how do you think nonprofit organizations can enhance their own organization's learning strategy and or process?
Yeah, so I definitely want to go back to what Dorothy said a few minutes back about iteration being very important. So my advice would definitely be within the development phase, which happens throughout, definitely don't be afraid of tweaking or adjusting your content or resources. It's often very normal to do so. So collecting feedback and collecting that data, using that data-driven learning to iterate over content and course design and just the main structure of the system in general, to ensure the optimal delivery of what you're putting out there for the learners. So using things like course ratings, formative and summative feedback, surveys, even the grades is always a good option to look at.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. With that, we'll also, Dorothy, would love to hear kind of any last recommendations that you have for nonprofits improving their organization's learning strategy and process.
Two big thoughts here. And one is don't be afraid to use e-learning as a strategy for real big change. So your organization has a mission. How can you use this tool of e-learning or digital resources to really make a difference around your mission area? We all tend to think what we're doing is small and not enough people know about us. If only they did, we'd be humongous and full of resources. Well, each nonprofit has an area they know and they have something to share, as we've all mentioned over time. And so be bold with it. For example, during the pandemic, we already had a course called the Equity Journey. We tweaked that course. We made iterative changes to make it much more personal reflection oriented and built in applied strategies. So here's how you could take what you just learned and put it into the world in your behavior. And we have organizations now using that course as the first step, right, of what sometimes is a very challenging conversations to have in your organization, in your community. Here, do this on your own, personal reflection, and then come prepared for a more facilitated, harder, or make it easier conversation around topics that you might be afraid to broach. So be bold. What you know, take it out there. Let people know about it. Use it. And then my second point is about using e-learning as a way to demonstrate your internal organization's commitment to being a learning organization. Make it a part of your culture that you're constantly bringing in new things. So we might have course designers who know their thing that they're going to do, or content experts. Well, all of our staff need to know those things too. Maybe not all at the same level, but e-learning is such a great way to expose our staff to more. They don't have to take the whole course. They don't have to do the whole experience, but maybe they do enough to apply it to their work to be better at what they do. So I think e-learning has such great implications, both internal to the organization, building this culture of learning, so that we're prepared for the future. And then externally, a way to share what we know and call for change on different levels.
Awesome. Thank you, Dorothy. Yes, be bold. All right, so now we're going to transition into the audience Q&A portion. So we've got some questions that were submitted ahead of time via the registration, and I'll dive into those. But don't hesitate to still submit your questions via the questions tab or the chat as we go through, and we'll work on answering as many as we can. But feel free to reach out to the NX Unite team afterward if your question wasn't answered, and we'll connect you with an answer for your question. So I'll kind of kick us off with this first question, which really is a good segue from Dorothy's point about using that learning strategy within your organization. But Dorothy, if nonprofits, or if someone's here today and they're like, yes, I am all geared up about e-learning for within my organization, what are some practical strategic steps that they can take to promote that within their organization, to their leadership, to the board? How can we get this conversation going?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to go back to one of the earlier questions you asked us. How do you create a successful program? Well, why? You've really got to start there. Why do we want to have a learning organization? Why do we want to embed learning in our culture? And hopefully there's a really good reason, because we want to make a difference in the world. And to do that then lays the groundwork for the types of things you might do. And again, I think you start small. So some sort of internal poll with some identified issues by the leadership about what you might do first, and then make sure it's successful. So make it really easy to do what you've asked them to do. I loved Vanessa's comment about gamification being in the answer to the world, right? Well, it's not. Just heads up. First, it's what do you mean by engagement, and what do you want that to look like? So how do you want that learning to play out? Mm-hmm. So as I think John mentioned, there's so much already created content out there for you to start with from an internal perspective. Start with that. See what you liked, what you didn't like. You be the client testing out these things. And then you can see, is this a bigger strategy for me? Do I really want to be an organization that hosts this content and takes it out larger? Really big step is to make sure everybody feels successful while they're involved.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pile on real quick. One thing we haven't talked about is, we talked about the iterative change a lot, but iterative change is only possible with a measurement strategy. Mm-hmm. What you're trying to achieve versus what you're actually achieving. And so another high quality trait of successful organizations is that measurement strategy doesn't come in year 2. It comes in day -1 of starting right there, because it's the corollary to knowing where you're going. And so what are the ways that you're going to know that you could get there? Is it going to be on measurement? Is it on learning engagement? Is it on the number of satisfaction surveys that come out? It doesn't matter. Every organization measures different things, but finding what you can measure and tracking to your success is something that helps you make those iterative changes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good 1-2 punch on that answer there. Thank you, Dorothy and John. All right, I'm going to turn to Dan for a different question that came in. How can you address multiple learning styles with online learning?
Oh, such a good question. And I think that it really comes down to what Dorothy had said a little bit earlier around how are we going to define engagement? What does that mean? And so there's a tool that's called Bloom's taxonomy. So if you live in the education space, you know what Bloom's taxonomy is. And really what that does for you is it defines what exactly is the engagement that we're after. Do we want people just to remember and understand, which is sort of the old school, thing that we would typically focus on? Or do we want them to analyze, evaluate, and ultimately create? What exactly is it that we want them to do? And then that helps to be able to drive, what does the e-learning look like like. And so if it's just purely remember and understand, well, no problem. Give them a video, give them a 5-question test and be done, right? But if it's deeper than that, if we really need them to be able to evaluate a circumstance or analyze the circumstance, maybe we create a scenario that they have to be able to do. Maybe they have to provide their own scenario that matches, and then they have to create a new plan from that. Well, that is a wildly different experience than creating just a video and posting it. And so that's where I think that the defining engagement and figuring out exactly what it is that we want the end learners to know is so incredibly critical as you're building out those learning pieces.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. Vanessa, I'm going to turn to you for our next question, which really calls back to something you mentioned earlier about how learning can be really a community building activity. Would you kind of share a few more strategies for this engagement that we've been talking about, as well for engaging users and supporting social interaction when they're e-learning?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the aspects can definitely be utilizing different spaces within a digital environment. So things such as groups or teams, forums where people can just openly come as they are and not be expected to do anything special. They can just show up and participate in these environments. Also utilizing, and this kind of goes a little bit back to what Dan was just saying, because I think a really important part of really utilizing your digital space well and also personalizing it to the learner in terms of style is utilizing different roles within a digital environment for your learners. So having that expert and learner interaction, the mentorship, the coaching, apprenticeship, even tutoring accessible within your space really helps to meet that personalization, because then you have more one-on-one happening. And when you have more one-on-one happening, there is more space for the learner to be heard and for the learner to really talk about what their exact needs are and then having them met exactly where they are.
Can I add one thing there?
Go for it, Dorothy.
We forget that learning should be fun. And this, when we think about peer engagement, there sometimes is this heavy weight involved with it, that I'm going to be critiquing somebody and then they're going to critique me. But they're really fun ways. And there's some, I love to just test new things out there. And you may have tested this app called Wonder. Have you tested it?
No.
Where you go to this space and you can move across groups to answer different questions or to do different parts of a project. It's just fun, right? The facilitator can post a question and then you have to go all do these. So looking for, doesn't have to be always that way, but these moments of just, I'm really enjoying myself while I'm learning here. Reinforce learning.
Yeah.
And if I could pile onto that, because I think it's a beautiful concept there, the idea of wonder. I think that going back to like, how do we start the conversation? I think that part of it is using an instructional strategy. For example, a simple one is a KWL strategy, right? Which is, what do you know? What do you want people to know? And then what did you learn? Well, the learning management system can be the very same thing that you can use there. So what do you already know about learning management systems? You'll be shocked that people know so much more, or maybe so much less than what you really think they do. And then number two, you ask them, like, what are the big questions that you want to know? So that way, as you're investigating these processes, is you're going to get questions that you never thought in a million years would come about, would be really critical to the organization. And then you keep track of all of the things that you have learned kind of along the way. And that could be something as simple as a Google spreadsheet, or just basically putting it into like a Word document. It doesn't have to be anything wildly complex. It can be done virtually just as you are now, but creating a structure for that conversation to occur will really prevent you from the, we'll build it and they'll come. Because as much as we'd love for that to happen, that doesn't happen that way.
Not from lack of trying.
No, that's true.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I think that just asking yourself, your organization, those questions. What do we know? What do we want to learn? What do we, what have people learned after the e-learning experience? Before we kind of dive into our last like overall question on that, and I know we've mentioned data kind of across several different answers, but John, I'd love to pose this one to you kind of as we're thinking about Dan's answer and the other conversations that we've had throughout this hour-long panel, where just like one tidbit for nonprofits starting their e-learning strategy to keep in mind when it comes to data that they should be collecting.
Well, I think Dan was talking earlier about the ecosystem of different applications that need to work together for an online learning program. So your data comes from that ecosystem. But I think the most important thing to remember is that it's not just the LMS data. LMS data is great. Who started, who's supposed to, who finished, who's got the certification, who's up, it's good on that. But where things start to sing is when you bring the organizational data and you bring them together, because that enables you to be strategic. And so the organizational data is your AMS system or your CRM system, which essentially do the same thing. They keep track of who all your members are and all their interactions with you, with your organization outside of training. And so all those interactions are things that you can use that data to help personalize things that go on inside the LMS and the reverse. So you can take that LMS data and things that people have done and where they are in their journey, and then help market some of the other things that you have in your other systems. So I think that the takeaway is to think that the data really, learning is part of your strategic data. And somehow you need to get that together, either bring it into the LMS or bring your LMS data into somewhere else. It doesn't really matter where it happens, but what matters is that you can get really, really smart for your organization when you have both pieces.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's awesome. Well, I've had such a wonderful time today hearing from all of our panelists and learning about learning very meta, and hoping to get one final piece of insight from you all. So today we centered our conversation around how e-learning can benefit nonprofits. So as nonprofits are going out from today, just one resource that you direct them to keep learning. And that they should know that's available to them about as they're diving into this process. So Vanessa, I'll start with you.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I missed the first part of the question.
No worries. So kind of today we centered our conversation around how e-learning can benefit nonprofits. So as they're going out from today, what resources would you direct the organizations to, or tools that they should know that's available for them as they're continuing this journey?
Yes. I would definitely recommend, and this might feel like a big step for a lot of people, but to unapologetically utilize demos. So especially if you're going for an LMS or any type of authoring tool, anytime you can hear from the people who advocate for that tool, to go into demos, to have virtual presentations about what that is, and to also insert yourself into conversations about how that's going to work for you when you address the why that tool might be needed for your organization, is probably the biggest piece of advice that I could give.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. All right, turning to you, Dan.
Well, you got it. And so I think that if I had one kind of piece of advice, it's going to be certainly to start with the why. And, why change and why now? And if that why is big enough, then it's time to go and to create a plan that really focuses on those initial metrics, as John had said. I think that John has an excellent tool on the Talents of Learning website, which basically there are these 9 steps. And it's a very linear sort of a process. And I think that John would agree with this, that it is not necessarily linear. So many times you don't know what you don't know. And so what we want to be able to do is go out there and visit demos, just like what Vanessa had described. Ask for resources. So for example, here at Blue Sky, we have so many resources that we can use to be able to help you decide, like, what is the appropriate LMS for us? How best should we create learning? How best can we even create things like sponsorships to be able to go on our site? And so we have a bunch of resources along the way to be able to do. And I'm certain that John has a bunch of those sort of resources in terms of choosing LMS or how to be able to do that well. And so I think that, that once you create your checklist of features, then start to call those LMSs. And it's okay to reach out to someone like me, someone like Vanessa, John, Dorothy, and say, what's worked? And, and what exactly are we looking for? And what are the things that I don't know that you wish I did before I entered this conversation?
Mm.
And that will start an entirely different conversation along the way. And as you build your knowledge more and more and more, it's inevitable that, that you're going to make a great choice.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Turning to you, Dorothy.
I took this question very literal. So where would I send people if I wanted to give them resources? And there are two websites that I go to a lot. And one is the NTEN.org site. They also hold a conference annually that just brings nonprofit technology folks together to talk about things. And they do have a lot of resources on their website. And on a much more practical level is TechSoup.org, TechSoup.org. By becoming a member at TechSoup, you can access a lot of technologies at a reduced price. And they do have a lot of really great articles to help you think through some of these things about LMS and CMS, all those things. And then I guess as a person who's done this a lot, I think, so demos, absolutely. Then if you can take a course, if you're looking for an LMS, actually take a course using that LMS. Get in there and get your hands dirty before you make a long-term commitment about anything. You want to, as Dan said, you want to know what you don't know up front if you can.
Awesome. Well,
thank you for the
Dorothy.
opportunity to be here today, Hannah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you
Great
for
conversation, you all.
John, would you close us out with your response to this question?
Sure. So I'm going to be self-serving. So if you go to talentedlearning.com, I started that site almost 10 years ago, and it's all free. And it contains about 300 blog posts, 50 different podcasts, 100 different webinars and panel discussions, all on this topic, all on how to create your plan, how to buy systems, thinking about feature sets, why you want to do things. That's what all the content is about to help. So I encourage you to go there. But we just rolled out last week as we had our 2022 awards. And so we have now 40 different vendor profiles, including Blue Sky and CYPHER Learning, as it turns out, where we have lots of information. We've got lots of capabilities. We've got reviews from me. We've got demonstrations. So you can go to one place and really kind of search in a safe environment to find out and test these different systems as everybody's talking about, so that when you do contact the vendor, you're not just spinning your wheels, you're finding somebody that's aligned with what you're trying to do. And that's probably the last piece of advice, is that there's 1,000 different learning systems out there, and they all do different things. And your goal as a buyer is to really try to put your blinders on and find one that has a whole bunch of clients like you, because that's when you know you're in the right spot. So that's my last piece of advice. This was a great panel. I'm always on the other side asking questions. I never get anybody to ask me questions. This was so much fun. I wish somebody had asked me to do it again.
Well, this was a lot of fun, and thank you, John and Dorothy and Vanessa and Dan for joining us. We have reached the end of our panel, so thank you all for sticking with us, and thank you for attending. I hope everyone enjoyed themselves and learned something that will benefit the work that you do. We've got a packed kind of going into fall of panels ahead of us, including one today at 3 p.m. and then 2 tomorrow, one at noon and one at 3 p.m. again. So on a variety of different topics in the mission-driven industry. So go ahead and sign up for those. Registration for all of the September panels is now open. You can keep an eye out on the NX Unite website or the NX Unite LinkedIn page to sign on there. As I mentioned earlier, we'll also be sending out some information to you all after this panel, including a survey that we really appreciate you filling out. And then we're looking forward to hearing what you want to see in more panels like this one. A pleasure speaking with all of you today. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.